on this issue of like whether intersectionality is good or bad for the movement, I I think hopefully everyone at this point, after Trump won and after so many people of color, gay people, I mean everyone moved to the right in the United States in light of the most recent election, and a lot of it was had to do with the tone of the left, this just censorious, hateful, aggressive tone that was so
Yeah.
off-putting that nobody wanted to be a part of it.
Yeah.
Having said that, even if the left didn't take that tone and had a more inclusive approach to intersectionality, the other critique of intersectionality that I think is quite sound, and this is like a more troubling critique for me because it's one that I'm not sure about, but it seems like the evidence shows it's true, is that there's a lot of value in just focusing on a single issue, right? So,
Yeah.
two pieces of evidence for this. Uh, David Cole, who's a law professor at Georgetown University, a very distinguished scholar of social movements. He wrote this book called Engines of Liberty, which examines social movements that succeeded and social movements that failed. And one of his central findings is that the social movements that succeeded were relentlessly focused in terms of their messaging discipline. They did not deviate from their main issue, whatever it was. But another piece of evidence is there's this paper, and I just Googled the exact title. People can look this up yourself, and I can send it to you afterwards if you want,
Yeah.
George. By For the record, these are two black academics. Not that it, makes a big difference in their experimental results. And it's published in the top political science journal. It's called "Which Identity Frames Boost Support for and Mobilization in the Black Lives Matter Movement: An Experimental Test." And this is one of the few experiments that I've seen that actually took data and took like a real world kind of situation and tried to figure out whether intersectionality works. And what they found, not only was that intersectionality does not work, and the specific test, I'll just
Oh,
explain the
you have
test.
to send me this paper afterwards, Wayne.
No, I will send it to you because I just think it's important for people to know what the facts of the world are. Again, like
Yeah.
if you're trying to create social change, you cannot do that if you're delusional. You have to be attached to the real world and real world data, and that was my background. I was a social scientist before I was an activist. And what the real world shows is when they did a test to try and convince people to write a letter on behalf of Black Lives Matter. I think it was like a letter advocating for better policies in policing. If they said, "Could you please write this letter because Black people are being killed unjustly," and they just added the words, "especially women" or "especially LGBT people," not only did that deter net participation, like fewer people, just adding those two words, especially women or especially LGBT people, actually made fewer people participate and join the movement. But very interestingly, in the same study, it didn't even increase participation among LGBT and women, right? If you added the word especially women, it didn't even increase the likelihood that women would participate. And they were kind of puzzled by this. But among those of us who actually practice message discipline and are constantly looking at what sorts of communication work, what sort of communication don't, it was not surprising to me, partly because of just message focus. It is very hard for people to wrap their heads around even a relatively simple message. And if you start expanding that message to complicated subjects, people are less willing to act, right? Like all else equal, a 5-word tweet is always better than a 500-word tweet. It just is. Because a 5-word tweet will be easier to understand. People will grasp it more quickly. They're more able to process it and act upon it than if you write like a 500-word essay, right? And the problem with a lot of intersectional campaigns is they just complicate the issue. And so, for example, someone who's sitting there at home deciding, should I write this letter? When you add the words, especially LGBT people, even if they actually support both causes, they might even support Black Lives Matter and LGBT causes, but they might just get confused and say like, okay, I'm trying to figure out what I'm supposed to write now. Like I understood initially when you just talked about Black people being killed, I should write about how police people are being killed. I don't actually quite understand how this intersects with the LGBT issue. And so now that I'm confused, I can't act, right? And that is a very common problem in social movements. It's literally, there's a term for this that Zeynep Tufekci, a sociologist in North Carolina, came up with. She's at UNC. She's a New York Times columnist, one of the most distinguished sociologists of our generation. She calls it tactical freeze. And the idea behind tactical freeze is basically when the decision-making becomes too complicated, there's too many stakeholders in the room, and I just can't even figure out what to do. And too often, I think this is what happens with intersectionality. So yeah, anyways, but I'll send you the paper afterwards.
It makes a big mess of things, Wayne. And you know what? The hilarious observation I wanted to make is they actually kind of agree with keeping other movements about that issue. For example, if you shout all lives matter at a Black Lives Matter protest, they'll say stuff like, we know that all lives matter, but
Yeah.
this movement is specifically meant to be about Black lives. But then what happens when intersectionals come into the animal rights movement? They're the all lives matter people of the animal rights movement.
No, I agree. They are. That is a very fair critique. Because I actually think it's fair for a Black Lives Matter protest to say, if someone comes in and says all lives matter or women's rights or gay rights, I think it's completely fair for them to say, look, that's not our issue. You know, we don't want that messaging as part of our protest because they're trying to create coherent, simple messaging that people understand. And yes, the all lives matter stuff, it becomes more complicated. We're trying to talk about racism here, and you know, there's a lot of problems that white people have, that Asian people have, but this is not the space for that. Mm-hmm. But you're right that if we believe that and we agree with that, then similarly, when someone who's a non-animal rights actor, who's even animal rights actors who wants to bring in Palestine or Israel or Gaza or October 7th or Hamas or defunding the police or gay rights or whatever it is into the animal rights movement, we should also be confident enough to say, look, that may very well be a very important issue for you and for others. However, the thing that is bringing us all together into this space is animal rights. And we need to focus on that. And it's not fair for you to talk about that other issue. I mean, the comparison I've made, which I stole this from Arthur Chu, who's a really smart guy on Twitter, is it reminds me of, like, say you're in the cancer wing of a hospital and you've got, you know, your mom. This literally happened to me. My mom died of cancer. And you know, we're sitting in this room after she's just had surgery. She had brain cancer surgery. They had to remove the top of her skull. Like, she was actually awake during this entire process too. It's such a creepy process. They literally keep you awake because when you do brain surgery, you have to keep the person awake because otherwise you can remove parts of the brain that will just like shut the person down, you know? So you're actually awake. It's like local anesthesia. They cut your skull off and they're like talking to you while they're cutting parts of your brain out for brain cancer surgery. Oh so God. Super freaky experiment. She's like in terrible condition afterwards. She's lying there, enormous amount of pain. Like there's nausea. It's like a terrible procedure. If someone had run into that room and started screaming, don't you realize people are dying of heart disease? What the fuck is wrong with you all? There's an emergency in this country. People are dying of heart attacks everywhere. I would have been like, you piece of shit.
Yeah.
Get out of here. Do you realize my mom is dying of cancer right now? How dare you come in? And that's not because I don't agree with what he's saying. It's just not the space for it. Like, have the common decency to realize that if we say this is a space for animals and animal rights, do not bring in other stuff to distract us from the thing we all said this is a space for, right? And similarly, if you got the cancer wing in the hospital, don't come in running and screaming and talking about heart attacks, even if we agree that heart attacks are a huge problem. And that's the way I feel like a lot of activists have hijacked the animal rights movement, that even if their issues are incredibly important, and I'd say this on both sides, like on the Israeli-Palestine conflict, I think on both sides, I think there are legitimate grievances that Jewish people and Israeli people have. I think there are legitimate grievances that Palestinian and pro-Palestinian people have. Just like I think there are legitimate concerns people have about heart attacks.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, the animal rights movement is not the space for you to litigate those disputes.
Agreed.
Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think
good.
I think your analogy was perfect there. So with the horrific issue of the brain cancer that happened to your mum, the metaphor there is these animals are going through just the most horrendous time. And then someone is running in 2020, whenever it is, and saying, why aren't you talking about this? And it's like, bro, get the fuck off our page. We're here to post about animals. You can find these other issues important if you want. We're not saying you shouldn't. We're not making a statement from the page saying not to care about these issues. But don't come to our page, start shitting on our page, trying to cancel us because we're not speaking up about your, comparatively, to be honest, microscopic issue.
Yeah. I don't even think we have to say it's a microscopic issue. And there are going to be disagreements about how microscopic any other secondary issue is. And secondary, not even in terms of importance. I mean, I do think animal rights is more important than the other issue. It's the greatest moral crisis facing the human species.
Yeah.
But even if I didn't believe that, right, say I was in the wing of a hospital where my mom just broke her arm and she was getting her arm fixed. And I would agree that heart attacks are a bigger deal than, arm fractures. Yeah. Nonetheless, if someone came in screaming, saying, stop working on your mom's arm. Don't you realize my mom has a heart attack? I'd be like, bruh, I realize that. Nonetheless, this is a space for arm fractures, not for heart attacks. That's kind of messed up for you to come in and scream at me because I'm just trying to help my mom, you know?
Yeah.
Now, it's for the animal rights movement, it's the opposite because everyone screaming at us is always talking about an issue that is just by objective measures, much less serious and much less severe because of the number and the degree of the suffering the animals are suffering. Yeah. But yeah, so we're in agreement there.